Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next session. We're going to be talking about how to effectively drive engagement through multiple channels, which is, I think, top of mind for probably everyone in this audience today. So before we jump into questions, I'm going to have my panelists introduce themselves, starting with TS.
Oh, all right. Hello. Well, good afternoon. Thank you. A pleasure to be here. My name is T.S. Kelly. I lead media effectiveness at Carat, and media effectiveness is just a fancy way of talking about performance analytics.
Cool. All right, move on to Carrie.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Carrie Tucker. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer and Head of Franchise Management for PocketWatch. PocketWatch is a studio that turns the biggest kid YouTube stars into global franchises.
Nice. And Kiara.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chiara. I'm Creative Strategy Lead for Coca-Cola in Latin America for flavor brands Fanta, Sprite, Schweppes. And thank you for having us here today.
Awesome. So I'm very excited to have you all here today to talk about this topic. I think it's something that it becomes very overwhelming for marketers, just given that it seems that a new platform pops up every day. So, how do you navigate the complexity of all the media channels that are out there? Just given that there are so many more today than there were in the past, and they continue to keep on rising. Kiara, I'll throw that one to you first.
So I think there's the only way to not get extremely anxious about all the new possibilities and the new things is to stick to the audience, right? Stick to the people strategy that we have. But a way that we kind of do is like, what are our fixed platforms and what are our experimentation platforms? Because they also have different goals and different ways to approach. But I think it's less about just wanting to jump in everywhere, but understanding what are the ones that fit into your own strategy.
Mm-hmm. And Carrie, talk a little bit about how you think of this from the content creator perspective.
Sure. So our primary goal at PocketWatch is to transcend YouTube stars off of platforms. So they're already pretty massive platform stars. And so the idea is, can we be everywhere that kids are? And so similar to Kiara is following the audience. So in our, way of thinking, if kids are there, then we should too be there. And that could be a new platform like TikTok, or it could be a platform like retail, right? And so when you think about e-com and some of the other opportunities, we see them all as platforms, especially because the convergence of content and commerce exists now on almost every platform.
Yeah, definitely. And TS, I'm curious on your thoughts on this, because you sort of look at it on the flip side, right, of like measuring all of these channels and how you can see if they're working and tie them all together. So what's your perspective in terms of, navigating new platforms, the complexity of it all?
Sure. The first thing we think about too is that we kind of tie it into a process. So, we call it, at Carat, we call it designing for people. So measurement is aligned to business goals. So if we're going to talk about new platforms, we tend to think of it almost like from a budgeting perspective, like 1-19-80. So think of it like test, migrate, and then integrate. And lots of things we can test. You test augmented reality, you can test 5G platforms, a number of those things. We get to the migration stage, we start seeing some efficacy, some ways of finding proof and consistency that aligns to business goals. And then, you can think of what that means to like certain types of addressable TV and how we're migrating. And then finally integrating and deprecating, where all of a sudden there's got to be another seat at the table for some of these new platforms, and they got to kind of shimmer their way. And I'm the youngest of 8 kids, so I had to find my way at a holiday table and sit at the big table. It took me till I was 14. So it takes time to get those chairs at the big table, and that's the process we try to do here too.
Right. And one thing that's interesting that sort of stood out about each of your answers, I think, is follow the audience, right? But for a brand like Coca-Cola, your audience could be anyone, right? So how do you figure out where is really worthwhile to invest when you're going after such a broad audience?
Well, I think we always think in the convergence of the creative with the media, right? And playing with audience segmentation or always helps, like the tribes. And then you can profile the type of content, the type of experiences that fits better this audience segmentation. And I think that helps a lot when we have our end-to-end plan to understand, because as you said, total pop is just like we risk talking to no one in the end because you end up being super generic. So that's the way in from a creative thinking, then understanding better these segments, these tribes of people.
Interesting. And I can imagine there's a lot of anxiety that comes up as a marketer when you see a new platform, like you hear everyone's on Clubhouse and you're like, what is Clubhouse and how am I supposed to be there and should I be there? Carrie, talk a little bit about how you manage the FOMO of new platforms.
Well, I think it's, yes, it can drum up anxiety, but I think our role as marketers is to be students of the business. And so first and foremost, we should know about everything that's emerging, as it's happening or before it happens, if we can help it. And so I think being students of the business helps us not have anxiety, right? Because there's a measured response, and an expectation that this is just the fastest moving environment. And so I think part of it is just in the job description, you have to, breathe your way through, the change. But I think, the other thing is knowing too that not all platforms, even if they are the most explosive thing, so Clubhouse is a great example, and I dove into it on a personal level just to understand what was happening. But from an audience standpoint, we represent kids and families, and they're not really in Clubhouse right now, right? Kids are not hanging out in Clubhouse in a meaningful way. And so while as a business person, I've actually learned a ton on Clubhouse and really listened to the commentary and the subjects that seem to pop up, I think I've learned everything I need to know about NFTs on Clubhouse. But I don't, for my audience right now, it isn't relevant. However, I'm fascinated by platforms like that where there are early adopters, brands that can go in. Now, that said, something like TikTok is, we have to look at very carefully and figure out how it fits into our narrative, and also how do we recruit stars, right? We're always looking for the world's biggest creators, and so these platforms a lot of times are the breeding ground for the next big popular creators. And so we look at it both from an audience standpoint and as a talent pool.
Interesting. TS or Chiara, any thoughts on managing the platform anxiety?
Actually, sure. We've been here before. This is a process that has not started. I was going to bring up, remember Second Life, going back a few years, maybe 2005, 2006. It still exists with a very small community, but it was an environment that was tested for a lot of brands. And those brand environments, most of them are ghost towns or turned into ghost towns, but they were still a viable testing environment. So it is important. And I remember having in those same types of years, conversations with CPG partners and FMCG thinking, okay, can I have 1% of the TV budget to put into search? So again, sometimes these platforms turn into something else. So again, it's always going to be part of the process, as Carrie mentioned. We just have to kind of be students permanently, and that's part of the joy of working in this space.
And if I can add, just for a brand perspective, because I totally agree that we need to study them, but as a brand going there, and personally, I'm more worried on being memorable than being the first. On actually understanding and create an experience that is worth people's time than just rushing to be there, to be visible there. So I think that also helps guiding.
Yeah, definitely. And it sounds like, it's important to test sometimes, but maybe not to just go all in on something that doesn't totally make sense. So I want to talk about the multi-platform world that we live in. Once you decide that it is worthwhile to invest in multiple platforms, and even if they're not new platforms, marketers have to be all over the place today. How do you manage your creative output across all of these different platforms, manage your audience, your frequency? How do you orchestrate a system that is just so fragmented? Who wants to grab that one first?
I'm happy to go. I think one, you create for the platform. That's a big one. I think gone are the days where you just cut down something that you created for one platform and put it on another. So I think really thinking, how does the content live in that platform to make it, to optimize it, make it really attractive. For example, we'll take, compilations of YouTube creative, repackage it in a way that makes sense for OTT, and then stream it, through OTT partners. And that sort of brings new life to the YouTube content, even though you're not creating new content. Or we create an entirely new format, and put it on Nickelodeon, for example. And so I think it's taking, a really good look at, one, where's your audience? Always go there. Where's your audience? And then two, the content that you have, is there anything that can be done that can be either edited, modified, repackaged, that might make sense for the platform? And if not, and if you, don't get lazy, it's tempting to get lazy about it. If you're not lazy about it and really think, okay, this is not great content for this platform, then how do we create content that is meaningful for the platform, and then therefore it will resonate with the audience? But to the question before, we don't need to be on every platform. You just need to be on every platform that your audience is on. And sometimes you have to pick, right? There's, for kids, it's still YouTube. And so we've got that covered, but kids are also, consuming a ton of streaming content, and even television, linear television to some degree. So, you have to prioritize also, by numbers, right? So where's the biggest audiences? Where's the biggest bang for your buck? Because creating original content can be expensive, and so you can't cut it for every single platform.
Right. Chiara, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I can complement. When we think about frequency and then consistency from a creative standpoint, and sometimes that's the barrier. It's not about repeating the same asset everywhere or the same thing, just adapt, but it's the consistency of the message and how you build this cohesive experience that plays with the context of the form and channel, because that's the power of bringing then creative and media together. Why people are on that platform, what type of things. They're not necessarily, how many times you see a beautiful wave you just cut into vertical mobile, and then the whole construction of that. So consistent to me comes on this frequency of actually the core idea, not the repetition of the same line or the same asset over and over.
Yeah.
One of the things I think is important, just to add to that, is planning. So I think that because there are so many platforms now, when you're creating original content, you need to consider those platforms when you're in production. Because I think one of the things that's really helpful to us now is take one shoot, right? Try to get as many things as you can during that shoot. And even if you have to create little mini sets or opportunities, for short form or for longer form, that the marketing is, planning is essential for marketing, and content creation is the same way. And I think, when marketing teams work hand in hand with production teams or studio teams, the best work comes out, because you plan for those platforms, you plan for the shoulder content, you plan for the hero content. And so the opportunity for us to create, you're not then retrofitting. So if you plan, you're not faced with retrofitting content that may or may not fit into the platform.
Right. I think we all marketers have learned that you can't just cut down to 30 and put it on TikTok, right? It doesn't work. So now I'm curious to hear from TS about how this all works on the back end. If you're spending on multiple platforms, you have to measure multiple platforms, and that's very difficult. So talk about, how you think about measuring the success of cross-platform campaigns, and, how much you weigh what's happening in one specific channel versus across the entire campaign.
I was just again listening to my two esteemed colleagues about this process, and again, I sometimes like being in the room, because I think about I'm about permanently 14 years old and sitting at the kids' table for the first 14 years of my life. But when the measurement folks are at the front, it's been enlightening, because I also find this process to be one of, you have to be a bit realist to climb the measurement mountain. You start with like performance, that layer of engagement, and then clearly, can you have influence over the brand? Again, you want to make sure that measurement analytics are in alignment with what the content is supposed to be. So we've got major partners that we work with, like again, GM, P&G, and Microsoft. Microsoft just did in Q1 a tie-in between Xbox and Marvel. It was huge and had a lot of great traction. We were able to measure it in a couple of different ways across all three of those, that climbing that mountain. But then there's also the other approach of if we're working with other brands where it's very discrete types of opportunities, and it's more appropriate to focus just on the engagement with a very specific audience. Carrie talked about, talking about making sure you're in environments where these folks are. So if it's a very discrete audience, it isn't this grand scale and reach discussion. It's much more of an engagement discussion. So I hate to be the realist in the room sometimes when we have these conversations about content creation, but in many cases, we have to look specifically at what measures performance in a realistic fashion. So engagement is a key one that we can have a lot of fun and flexibility with. But again, I tend to be that person that, okay, we got this budget, we have this, make sure we're as tight on measurement as possible to make sure that we're providing some sort of influence. But you can always overshoot the mark from measurement in this case.
Well, measurement is difficult, especially as more platforms proliferate. So how do you think about, where would you say cross-platform measurement is right now in the industry? Is that even realistic, or are you really mostly measuring like specific channels? And
I mean, cross-platform, I think everyone on this call would agree that cross-platform is the North Star. We want to understand overall performance of the brand to our target audience, our best customers, the customers we want to speak to. I think of it as that we have these tests underway globally, WFA, in the US, we certainly have IAB and ARF and a number of different initiatives to combine different channels. And most of the tests right now are deduping impressions, which is great, it's okay. But I think of stepping stones in that process, and we've been doing this with the groups for a long time, is that we combine TV and search, combine TV with other flavors of video, connected TV, et cetera, to dedupe as much as possible. You talk about that reach number as well as frequency. Those are the building blocks. And then you want to get into behaviors and other types of outcome analysis. Starting with getting that reach right is key. And we do that by almost like a square dance. We have to kind of pair the channels together and make sure they fit right. And then we can dedupe them from there, or what we call halo analysis. So it's very possible to do that today. So again, it isn't some North Star unreachable approach for cross-channel. It's just that the tests right now are really about more holistic approaches. And there are practical approaches that you can take now to just combine individual channels together.
Yeah, it seems like as the number of platforms grow, it also becomes like the number of metrics you can use to measure success are growing. And, there's always been a traditional divide between brand and performance, but as the number of platforms that we're using sort of blend together, brand and performance are blending together, right? So how do you think about those types of initiatives and measurements when you're trying to do a full funnel campaign across platforms?
Sure. Our esteemed colleague from Coca-Cola said something before about end-to-end measurement. And that's a challenge today, because think about, we're kind of almost like two opposing forces. We've got the deprecation of the cookies as well as IDFA, which were used primarily for really to refine individual behavior metrics. So a lot of the response metrics that you see. And then the other end, you have folks that, again, you have like say MMM. So you have the response metrics that are going away, and then you have MMM data that gives us a lot of understanding of integration, but they could take, in some cases, years. So we find ourselves to do end-to-end, kind of almost meeting in the middle. I call it almost like efficacy measurement, being able to take the best parts of doing like MMM, which allows us to put those channels together in a modeling perspective, but then also provide, say, Coca-Cola or any other brand, the dynamic metrics to go from initial interaction to advocacy. So the reason I mentioned before is like combining search. Search is a really good indicator of expressed intent. So if there's a huge brand campaign going on, could we look at search activity that's aligned to it to see those two things together? So like an organization called EDO that does that pretty well as you can do it, if you get the fire hose of Google yourself, but combining those two to give indicators. So going end to end, every step along the way requires to have data sets that can combine it. So anyway, there's no magic formula, but right now I call it meeting in the middle and doing efficacy measurement to combine the best of MMM or MMM Lite and the metrics we still have left and the data we still have left as cookies and IDFA go away.
Right. So Kiara, how are you thinking about this end-to-end customer journey? You know, at such a large global brand like Coca-Cola, I would imagine it gets very complicated very quickly. So talk about how you think about that.
I mean, as TS was saying, the complexity of it, but the way we operate is we start from the end-to-end journey to understand what, because the thing is, I think as a creative, it's important that creative in our industry really understand media. Otherwise, we are just, telling stories in a way that not necessarily will be effective. So I worked really close together with the end-to-end team, but they provide like, that's the journey, and it's one journey, because we used to see like consumer journey, shopper journey. Sometimes they are the same, sometimes they're not. But looking at that, which are the channels and all those things. But to me, it's really like the good conflict between creative and media, in a sense of, I can deliver to you many numbers, but are people absorbing the message the way we want? So I try to have for each campaign a bit of some key metrics that to me reveal the success from a creative perspective. For example, the earn it over the pay, like the conversation that an idea generated. So I could reach X amount of people with the money that we have, but actually it went further on earn it conversation on top of it. So that shows that content, got more than what we paid for. So that's, to me, at least in my creative brain, that I try to learn from observing these metrics on how to push it further and use the paid media as to impose the content further.
Okay. So mixing a little bit of earned and paid.
Yeah.
In your measurements. Carrie, talk about how do you think about this? Did you want to add something?
No, I just said trying.
Oh, okay. Yes, we're all trying. So Carrie, how do you think about this question in terms of, managing success across all of these different platforms?
Yeah, it's a little different for us because the managing of data when kids are your target audience is very different. And so we always say it's kids and families, right? We're always going after mom and dad as well. But when you think about audience, right, and we think about the sort of rabid fandom that that we have in kids, and we're talking, 3 to 9-year-olds, right? You cannot collect data on children. And so it is against the law. And so, we take very seriously the privacy, and the rules and regulations around collecting data for kids, and the brands that we work with also obviously need to do that. And so we are hamstrung to some degree on, when you think about segmentation and you think about some of the tools that a Coca-Cola or a Carat client can employ, we cannot do that. And so, and then we also have to be very careful and sensitive about the messages that we're putting out with our brand partners, because, with, this massive audience that we command, that we reach, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. And so we take very seriously the safety and the advertising messages that are delivered to kids. And so our way of looking at measurement has to be a little bit different, and it tends to be bifurcated. We've got parents, and we can apply all the classic rules that Chiara and Tias talked about to parents, and then we have to manage the nag factor, what we call the nag factor. And so we've got this content that reaches kids, billions and billions of views a month, and we can't really track it in the way that we'd like, but we look at engagement, we look at what happens after videos are posted, and then traffic from mom, because again, these kids aren't spending their own money, and we're not funneling them through in a typical consumer funnel. And so we have to rely on the nag factor, right? They see it, they tell mom, and then mom is the purchaser. So we have an extra step that we have to go through, because we have to make sure that the kid is pulling on, mom's shirt saying, I want this thing, and still balance the responsibility that we have to what those things are, right? We take very seriously the partners that we work with. We take very seriously the messages that get put in front of kids, so that when they are nagging their mother or father for something, we also feel good about that something. And so our measurement is restricted for a reason, and we take it very seriously, but it it means we have to be more creative about our messaging.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the situation you're in, obviously, COPA, the child privacy law, is its own whole can of worms, but the whole industry is losing identifiers and the tracking mechanisms they used across platforms soon. So maybe they could learn a thing or two.
Yeah, so yeah, call me. We know all about being restricted, so.
As much as I would love to go down the rabbit hole of cookie deprecation, we do have a few questions from the audience that I'd love to get in before the session ends. The first one is a general question for anyone who wants it. Do you feel that engaging on new platforms like Twitch and Clubhouse can jeopardize brand safety? So how do you manage the brand safety concerns of jumping onto new platforms that aren't necessarily as regulated or moderated?
I think it depends on your point of view to consumers controlling the narrative, right? I think it's, if you're going to be in, and look, a lot of platforms, certainly conversational platforms, you're handing over, if you're going to be part of an environment that is forming, that doesn't have, guardrails or controls, then you're willingly stepping into, the foray, and you're willing to accept that this is a learning environment. And I would imagine you have to do so with caution, which is why testing is usually, a big part of a brand, or a creator for that matter too, because the creators who step into these platforms also have to understand what they're stepping into as well, and monitor, some of the conversations that are happening. But I think it's, it's balancing the risk of, of being in new platforms and the benefit of being there. And I think it just takes constant monitoring.
I actually, that word monitor is the key one, is that there is a risk involved. You want, especially when you're going up to say a Twitch audience, certainly understand that. But the part of this process, which I think is important, is that we're also living where there's a lot of real life events around us. I mean, civil unrest, racial unrest. There's also the sensitivity to making sure that we're also sensitive to that. So when we think of those platforms, we're also looking at making sure that we're aligned to the brand's needs and saying, okay, you know what, we're stopping, we're pausing right now until we can take a breath and understand what the implications are, and then we will continue again. So there is this constant monitoring. There's no more launch and forget. It isn't just running a TV campaign on I Love Lucy or any other show. It is a constant nurturing, constant vigilance. So that's what keeps me up at night, actually, Carrie. So all I do is monitor.
The only thing I will add is also to understand, depends on your product and your category, the policies on engaging in platforms that you cannot segment audience. Sometimes you have brands that you cannot advertise to any specific audience. So if the platform doesn't allow you to, so there's a few policies that you also need to consider when entering new ones.
Right. So Chiara, a question for you specifically. Did the pandemic force you to use different channels to engage with consumers, for example, e-commerce?
Yes, I think forced everyone to, I mean, depends on, of course, the category and the brand that we are. In our case, the behavior change on being more at home. So naturally, the consumption behavior also changed. So it's almost like the weight and the understanding, plus the acceleration of the digital experiences, right? It's not only our industry, all the industry accelerate the e-commerce experience, digital platforms, social media. So the brand really needs to be fast enough to follow and emerge into that. So 100% it required a lot of like learning on the go.
Yeah, I can imagine that. If it was fast paced before the pandemic, really.
Yeah, but I love it, to be honest. It's good when you push the industry forward, and you have to go. You have to go forward.
Right. Okay, and one quick one for TS before we wrap. Do you think that the pandemic forced brands to overinvest in short-term measurement and activities at the cost of long-term brand equity? And how do you strike the right balance?
Well, I think the pandemic made us think, I mean, we talked about certain channels turned on and off. So we had to think short-term because there was so much movement of budgets, so many changes that were happening. So I wouldn't necessarily say the pandemic was a changer. It was more so that we had to have a whole nother set of rules, and some of them were atypical, but now some of them are becoming more or indoctrinated into the process. So I use that word monitoring again, is that I don't think that's ever going to turn off, because I think with this dynamic that we have today, where we're working from home and we move to a hybrid model, I think there's going to be much more of a dynamic approach towards measurement. As I said, I called it meet in the middle, is that even though the deprecation of the cookie and IDFA is happening, there's still an expectation of dynamic measurement that we can provide end to end. We can provide in a much more real time dynamically. So I actually think that all it did was caffeinate that process, and it's not going to turn off. So I expect to have long hours in the future, happily so, of monitoring performance ongoing. That's just realities today, and it's a great place to be in analytics. That's for sure. There's plenty to do.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, balancing brand and performance? We're good. All right. Well, that is the end of our time. Thank you guys so much for joining us. It was a great conversation. Really important topic. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you.